I was talking about the commandments yesterday, and we had arrived at examining the virtue of religion in the third commandment. And in this commandment, what the commandment is seeking to do is to encourage you to experience the acts of religion. And that is not just true of Christians, it's true of Jews and it's true of pagans. Remember, there are two interior and two exterior acts of the virtue of religion. The interior acts are prayer in your intellect and devotion in your will. The exterior acts are adoration and sacrifice. A person's devotion is aroused when they make an act of worship to God, and that devotion is expressed then by them in some sort of prayer. Now, I don't necessarily mean vocal prayer, petitionary prayer, though of course that's the most common. But I mean a prayer which involves you requesting things from God and also elevating your mind and your heart to Him. These are expressed by exterior acts. Catholicism is an extremely incarnational religion. In other words, it takes seriously the fact that God took flesh. And so we express in fleshly actions our devotion and our prayer. And yesterday I told you, I'm just finished reviewing yesterday, that in adoration there are three basic acts. You have the act of respect for those who have experienced devotion and are in heaven, and we call that doulia in Greek. That's distinguished from respect for she who is so devout and so prayerful that her very act of faith is the means by which Christ is conceived in her body. And that's, of course, the Blessed Virgin. And the term we use for that, remember we talk about hyperactive, which means overly active. Well, the devotion or the respect we use for that is called hyperdulia, to distinguish it from all the rest of the saints. But then there's also a special kind of adoration, an adoration which is due to God alone, an adoration which is expressed in things like genuflecting before the Eucharist and incense and all kinds of means by which we represent that the presence of God is here. And that is also called by a Greek term, which is latria. Only God is worthy of this, and of course, Christ, because He's in person, God, the second person of the Trinity. So our worship of Christ's body while He's on earth and after He's gone to heaven is latria. I told you the story that when I first gave talks to Mother Angelica, the first talk on the live show was on the Mass as heaven on earth. And so the programmer was there taking notes to prepare for the live show. And she said, oh, you know, Mother's going to eat this up. She's going to love this. But then she said to me, but I'm a Methodist, you know, I don't believe in any of this. But she said, I don't quite understand you Catholics, because if I believed about the Holy Eucharist, what you say you believe about the Holy Eucharist, I'd be prostrate on my face every time I went into the church. And yet oftentimes in church today, before Mass begins, not so much here, but there are places where it's common. People are doing the gossip. You know, you do it at a cocktail party. You can't hardly find a quiet place in the church to think because they're too busy sharing. You know, they all sit together, etc. So the special kind of adoration is reserved to our Lord alone. And that would include the icon of our Lord. Because as I told you yesterday when I talked to you about icons, St. Thomas said, we don't reverence the thing, we reverence the person the thing represents. So the fourth aspect of the virtue of religion, which is commanded by keeping the Sabbath holy, is sacrifice. And in the Old Testament, you had various sacrifices, the peace offering, the sin offering, but the ultimate sacrifice was the Holocaust, in which the entire victim was consumed. Well, in this case, every time a Mass is celebrated, we have a sacrifice in which Christ is both the priest and the victim. And the primary celebrating priest isn't us. I mean, we are like the instrument, but it's God himself. Because remember, when the priest pronounces the words, "This is my body and this is my blood," he's not acting in the person whose name is on his driver's license or his passport. He's acting in the name of Christ the high priest, who is celebrating that Mass because he's making his sacrifice in an unbloody way present on the cross, so that we, in this place we're in, can participate in it. Unfortunately, after Vatican II, for various reasons, the Mass shifted in its emphasis more toward communion than toward sacrifice. There was a cardinal who attended Vatican II who said this: the essential center, the sacrificial action itself, suffered a perceptible shift toward communion, and that the entire sacrifice of the Mass was changed into a Eucharistic meal, whereby in the consciousness of believers, the integrating element of communion replaced the essential component of the transforming act of sacrifice. Well, we were encouraging people to come back to frequent communion because for centuries, especially because of heresies like Jansenism, when I was a boy, on a given Sunday, you might have 600 people in church. 2 or 3 alone went to communion. So they were encouraging people to return to frequent communion, but unfortunately, like all things, some people distorted it to de-emphasize that the Mass was a sacrifice. And so the character of what the commandment demands, which is that we offer ourselves with the host at the offertory, we receive in the consecration the Holy Trinity, especially in the form of Christ, from heaven, and then, if you're worthy, as a final integrating element, you also participate fully in this action, and you go to communion. But remember, the commandment is not to go to communion on Sunday. The command is to assist at Mass, to be present at Mass. And the only person who has to receive communion at a Mass, and it's both forms of it, is the priest, the celebrating priest. Someone asked me a question last night about why we didn't go under both forms in some places. Well, that was a permission granted. But you know, for centuries, people only went to communion under one form. And the reason was partially financial. I mean, it costs a lot of money to supply precious blood for so many people. And also because of the danger of sacrilege, because it was much easier to spill the precious blood than to, in some way, do dishonor to the consecrated host. Now, after Vatican II, they've allowed communion under both forms in a much more common way. It's still optional, but the person isn't receiving more of Jesus. Remember, the whole Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity, is under each element. So if you receive the body or you receive the blood, you receive the whole Christ. The reason the priest has to receive both is because of the completion of the sacrificial act. But the laity don't. And unfortunately, again, people often emphasize only the communion part. I don't know if I told you the story I did in the morning, that I was talking about this, and a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, you're right about this, because we were down at the beach and there was a chapel on Sunday, but no priest. So a sister came to lead a communion service, which consisted of readings and the reception of Holy Communion. Well, as we walked away from the chapel, my girlfriend said to me, you know, I like Sister's Mass much better than Father's. It's much shorter. You know, she hadn't tumbled to the fact there was an important part missing, which would be the offertory and the consecration. So this is what's commanded by the third commandment. After all, if the Mass is an action of love, if it's the presence of our salvation from heaven, if we're participating in the holy court of heaven, you know, the saints that cast around their crowns around the glassy sea, why is it that people don't come? Why is it they fail to attend? And that's why the church has made it a mortal sin to knowingly, you know, and also in your power, your control, to miss Mass on Sunday. If you got a broken leg, nobody expects you to go. But if you just don't want to do anything, want to watch the football game or something, or you're too tired, that's not a legitimate excuse. It's the sacrifice of love. And if we say we love God, we need to go to his house occasionally and receive him. So that's the third commandment. Now, the fourth commandment introduces us into our obligations to our neighbor. Some people objected in history that there was no statement to love your neighbor as yourself in the Ten Commandments. Well, the fourth commandment is the positive expression of that, and the others that are negative have to do with the vices or the evil acts that war against loving your neighbor as yourself. What the fourth commandment seeks to introduce is very much like the third. The third, remember, has to do with justice, with giving rights to someone who we could never repay for what we received. We could never repay God for what we received from him. But in the fourth commandment, we also have an obligation to seek to repay someone we can't repay for things that they have given us as instruments of God. They have given us as instruments of God because they have given us a gift that is important for us, but we can't, by equal justice, give it back. So, the primary example is the gift of life. And that's the reason why the language of the commandment turns around parents. The virtue that it's trying to implement is called the virtue of piety. Now, that doesn't mean pious thoughts in church. What it meant in the ancient world was the attempt to repay someone you can't repay. And the first and most important of those people would be your parents. You can never repay, obviously you can't be your mother's mother. You know, you can't give her back the gift of life. I was fortunate before my mother died, and I wouldn't say that we had, you know, the most affectionate of relationships, but I was fortunate to be able to tell her, thank you for having me. Who would have wanted to miss all this, you know? All the good things. We all have bad things too, but all the good things, who would have wanted to miss those things? And so there's a special relationship between parent and child which turns around the fact of the goodness of being. We're good because we exist, first of all. And the parents are the first people who should communicate that to us. Now, unfortunately, because of contraception and various other things in our society, oftentimes parents approach their children as an object of use to make up for what they never had. So, from it's good that you exist, sometimes they take the idea, you're good because you succeed or you make me feel good. That's the reason I love you. No, the reason has to be because we have spiritual souls because we exist. And by the same token, there are obligations of children toward parents. Today, these are very greatly questioned. Authority is one of them. We owe our parents, if we're minors, we owe them obedience and respect. If we are adults, we don't owe them obedience anymore, but we owe them respect. Respect for the fact that they sacrificed to raise us. Now, this is really, really important, and it's largely neglected today. I know a group of sisters who run a preschool near Hartford, Connecticut, and they're from Italy and India. And this preschool is so popular that people sign their children up for it in the womb, So I asked the sister one time, how are things going? You have a new school year with the little ones. And she said, Father, every year it gets harder and harder because the parents are afraid of their own children. And they don't know how to be parents. They want to be buddies. And you can't be a buddy and also be an authority figure. So children owe parents' obedience, but parents owe children quite a lot too. For one thing, parents owe to children the education which they should receive in order to go to heaven. I remember when we talk about the purpose of parenting in Catholicism, we say procreation and education of children. Now, what do we mean by education there? Reading, writing, and arithmetic and a master's degree? No, that's not what we mean. Education, in this context, refers to an education in the virtues. The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it this way: the right and duty of parents to educate their children is primordial and inalienable. In other words, no state can take away from us the right to educate our children. And they can't force us into schools where we disagree with what's being taught. Instead, God wishes to manage the education of a child, which is a person that God is preparing for heaven, to teach them through the parents self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery. As a result, if they can't live these virtues themselves, how are they going to teach it to their children? In addition to this, parents are the first apostles of their children. The teaching and manner of living religion in the home is the foundation of the child's idea about God. If the parents are too demanding, if they're too strict, if they are never showing their children any affection or approval, that's the way a person begins to look at God, a demanding, absolute taskmaster. And they interpret religion in the same way. Instead, our parents have a duty to us to basically exercise what's necessary for the formation of a human soul based on where the child is. So, normally, in Catholic ideas anyway, the mother's influence because of her emotional structure, because she's connected to the children by a bond the father doesn't have. Obviously, the child came from her body, her flesh. It really is a part of her flesh. And women can almost intuitively tell if children are having a problem or not, even in the womb, before they can speak, because they have this kind of emotional rapport. So in the primary years, the emotional formation of a child is the most important thing, and it's the mother's place to do that. Once a person reaches being a teenager, the father's intellectual guidance is necessary. And I'm sure you're aware that the one institution that's in most trouble in our society is fatherhood. People don't think children need fathers. Women now can have children on their own. They can do it by vitro fertilization, and they can raise them on their own. But father's presence is absolutely necessary. He doesn't have to say a lot, but he has to be the rock, the spiritual rock, on which the wife and the child or children rest, so that they can be free to be themselves. If the child sees a father who's not destroyed by the world and by the job and all those things, it obviously can't be too bad a place to live in, so they can approach it more easily. And when I was teaching high school, I used to be amazed sometimes at the way fathers would treat their sons, because especially when it comes to the formation of a male, this is extremely important. I remember one poor kid. He was this huge guy. He was very athletic. His father had been a polio victim. And his father would sit at the baseball game, and if the boy struck out, his father would start screaming obscenities at him from the sidelines. You know, we were sitting there, the brothers, going, "This is not the way." We know what you're trying to do, but this is not the way. And of course, in the end, the son wound up decking his father. He was so frustrated. And yet, many men are repulsed by their sons, especially when they're in the 9th grade or the 8th grade. I think this is true generally of teenagers, having taught them for years, that the parents are kind of appalled by the behavior of the children when we're teenagers. And I kept saying, just be patient. Believe me, I'm appalled too, but they do grow out of it. You know? I remember when I finished teaching high school, I went to teach in the university, and a couple of the students from the high school went to that university. So the first day on campus, they saw me in my habit, and they went, "Oh, Father Brian, hello, oh." And I went, "Wait, oh, it is true. I now see the evidence. You do become human beings after high school." And of course they go, "Do, do, do," like this, you know. So, and I don't know, remember that girl Greta that went before the United Nations? I said, here are these world leaders listening to a teenager. They're insane. Teenagers don't know anything. I mean, they're good people, and you can get a lot out of them if you play the little game and let them think it's their idea. Once they think it's their idea, they'll come there 24 hours a day and work for you. But you know, they're kids. They don't know anything, and you're letting the world be guided by a teenager? I mean, what's your problem anyway? So we have an obligation to educate children according to what God plans. And that includes now, also Catholic ideas of discipline are very interesting too. Because we don't hold to what, for example, the British public schools used to do, which is cane boys practically to the flesh, because the devil had to be beaten out of them. See, we don't agree that men are totally depraved by nature. We think that they're basically good, but they need to be curbed. So even though you're not forbidden from doing physical punishment, it has to be rare and can't be too drastic. And what I again found teaching high school, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to beat up the kids. For one thing, they could probably beat me up, they were so big. But all you have to do is one little thing, and that makes it clear who's in charge. And they respect that. They may not show it because it's a big game, but they respect it. I remember I had a kid, I caught him, he is now a judge advocate. And so he came over to see me one time recently, because he lives in the Bay Area and I don't. And we were chatting about school and all that stuff. And I said, Jeff, remember the 2 times I caught you cheating on a test? Yes, Father. Like this. Well, Jeff was so stupid. I caught him cheating on a test. Now, you'd think if you're going to do it a second time, you'd alter your mode of operation. He did it in exactly the same way. And boy, I was all ready for him, I mean, gosh. It's amusing trying to educate a soul. But that's what the 4th commandment is primarily about. In regards to discipline, we have Sirach 30:1-2. Whoever loves a son will chastise him often. Whoever disciplines a son will benefit from him. But fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Exaggerated punishments have never been the way the Catholic Church looks on the whole thing. Now, the commandment is couched in family life, but there are other people that we receive things from we can never repay. For example, the ability to be raised in a fairly just and ordered society. So we also owe a certain respect for our patria, our fatherland. This doesn't mean we always respect the people who are running the fatherland as individuals, but because their offices represent our land, our country, we owe kind of respect to the office. And in addition to this, the respect, of course, doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything we're told to do. In fact, sometimes people act beyond the bounds of justice in authority, and they command us to do things which are contrary to the natural law. Well, those things don't oblige us in conscience. In fact, in conscience, we're obliged to disobey them, not to obey them, or at least to try to escape from them and the consequences by not promoting the issue. But a respect for our country is very important. And today, there are lots of people in our country who hate the United States. And you want to go try living somewhere else. Wait till you go there. You'll see. We do not have a perfect country. The Puritans thought they were founding the society of God on earth. I mean, the shining city on the hill of John Winthrop was basically an attempt to say that the new land they came into was like heaven. Well, no. The only society of God on earth is the Catholic Church. But given the formation of our country and the way it occurred, we certainly have had a fairly stable government, with the exception of the Civil War, for all the time of its existence. And we have to thank God for that, because it allows us to carry on a certain measure of ordered life. In addition to this, interestingly enough, a part of this commandment, again, has to do with things you can never repay. But there's a certain respect that you owe to the person who gave them to you. One of the virtues that falls under this commandment is thankfulness, thanksgiving. Many people in our society never say thank you. And yet, that's common courtesy. It helps to preserve relationships among human beings. And believe it or not, Aristotle enumerates a virtue in piety, which is friendliness. That we generally have a benevolent attitude toward everyone in the human race, even people we don't know. Also liberality, also affability, and even kindness. Now, you can't command these things. They're not a matter of strict justice, but they're a manner in which we preserve a good society. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but Teresa of Avila, when she wrote The Way of Perfection, talked about how nuns should act. Now, you would think that nuns should be serious, right? My classic image for this is the old film song of Bernadette, and the Mother Superior in that film, who's basically convinced that Bernadette can't have seen Mary at Lourdes because she hasn't suffered enough. And so she says to her, all throughout sacred time, God has only come to those who have suffered. How can you say you have seen her when you have not suffered as I have? Look at my eyes, they burn like the very fires of hell. From lack of sleep I will not give them. My lips are parched from constant prayer. My hands are racked from constant toil. My back is gnarled from cold stone floors. And that's supposed to be kind of a spiritual perfection. Well, listen to what Teresa of Avila says. The most important thing for nuns, the holier they are, the more sociable they should be with their sisters. Never keep aloof from them if you wish to help them and to have their love. We must strive hard to be pleasant and humor the people we deal with and make them like us, especially our sisters. Because, you know, religious life is supposed to be an image of heaven on earth. Now, if you have a religious, a sister or a priest, who's pouty and unhappy and always off-putting, I mean, who wants to go to a heaven like that? You know, so she encourages people to realize that we have a happy religion generally. It's true we suffer. God will certainly give us plenty of suffering. In my order, there's a famous story about St. Dominic, that the novices were laughing uproariously about something one day, and they were reproved by a stern older friar. And St. Dominic saw this scene, and he said, "Oh, let the novices laugh. They're going to have plenty of time for suffering when they get older. Let them enjoy themselves now while they still can." So, this is a commandment, and it's a commandment on the part of God, respect for others, even those we cannot repay, and we have a certain debt to them which we can't repay. The fifth commandment begins and introduces us to the negative commandments. Now, it's important to realize that positive commandments bind always, but not in every circumstance. And the reason is because, for example, in honoring your parents aren't always there. Or in keeping hold of the Sabbath, it's not always the Sabbath, you know, it's once a week. But negative commandments bind always and in every circumstance. They are absolutes. You can't get around them by saying, well, I generally think abortion is murder, but my daughter needs it. Or there are extenuating circumstances. No, there are no extenuating circumstances. However, it's also important to realize that things may look like something externally and not be that thing morally. So, first of all, why do we have human dignity that we have to respect? Why do we have a right to life? Well, we have a right to life because we have an immortal soul. And that's why everyone has to be respected in their life. The right to life is the most basic of all rights. Now, does that mean that a person can never kill another human being? The Catechism defines murder as the direct taking of an innocent human life. It also quotes Scripture, "Thou shalt not slay the righteous and the innocent." So that suggests that there's a distinction in this commandment between guilty human life and innocent human life. And so there are actions which look like murder, but in fact are not contrary to the commandment, but keeping them. And we need to emphasize, too, that the actions involved here only have to do with human beings because they have a spirit. I'm sorry, I know the animal rights activists will be very upset with me about this, but you can't murder an animal. You can be cruel to an animal, but you can't murder an animal. Animals do not have reasoning souls, and they exist basically to serve us in various capacities. So this commandment only has to do with human beings. The right to life, then, does not include exceptions to it. There are no exceptions to the right to life. However, there are actions which look like taking human life, but it's not done unjustly. So, 3 examples. One is very controversial today. And again, I don't want to dogmatize about this, but I just want you to show that you may be against this and still be a Catholic, but it's not murder, all right? First of all, I want to talk about the first 2. A soldier killing someone in a just war, another soldier, is not violating or having an exception to the 3rd commandment, because the other person attacking his country is looked upon as an unjust aggressor. And as a result, he's not innocent in the attack. Normally, until the 20th century, and actually until Napoleon, which would be 200 years ago, people looked upon people as fighting for a king, something like that. But when Napoleon and France, warfare got shifted to being nation against nation, and everyone was looked upon as a combatant. This really isn't true. That's why civilian populations should have been protected. But because of the almost wholesale warfare of millions of people in the 20th century, as you know, civilian populations, they began to attack them too, big time. In fact, there wasn't even an enmity, a personal enmity. You weren't fighting this other person for private revenge. I don't know if you're aware of this, but during the First World War, I believe it was at Christmas in 1916, the German soldiers and the Allied soldiers called off the war in a part of the lines for Christmas. And they all met in the middle in no man's land, and they had a Christmas party. And they sang carols, and they exchanged greetings and the whole thing. Then they went back to shooting each other the next day in the trenches. Also, it's interesting in our Civil War, I watched the film Gettysburg, and there was a Confederate General, Armitage, who was in Pickett's charge. And before the war, he had been the best friend of the Union, a Union general. And he managed to make it to the wall. But as he was wounded mortally as he was coming over. So the Union troops said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "May I inquire after the health of General so-and-so, my friend?" And they said, "Well, he's been wounded too." And then the Confederate general cried and said, "We can't both die on the same day." So, in other words, it wasn't a personal enmity of one man against another because of private revenge or something like that. The second example is a policeman. A policeman's an officer of the state. They even take an oath to act in the name of the law. So if they kill a person who's threatening innocent human life, let's say a shooter in a school or a sniper or someone who's robbing someone with a gun with lethal force, if the only way to resist the lethal force is the death of the attacker, that's not an exception to the fifth commandment. It's actually implementing it. Because the fifth commandment has to do with preserving and affirming the common good of human life as a right in society. Now, the last example is, of course, one that's very, very controversial today, and this is the example of the death penalty. You don't have to be for the death penalty. Obviously, the popes, especially the present one, are totally against it. But you will notice the language he uses. In the revision of the Catechism, they say this. John Paul II said it should be rarely used, if ever. They don't even say that. What they say is, consequently, the Church teaches in the light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person and the works and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. Now, what's strange is that when they put that in, first of all, they don't say it's a sin, because they can't. The whole Catholic tradition is weighted against that. Secondly, when they put that in, they didn't redefine murder. It's still the direct taking of an innocent human life. So obviously, there's some contradiction in this whole thing. And you don't have to be for or against the death penalty. That's a matter of your politics. But the one thing you can't say is that it's condemned by the Fifth Commandment, because no one ever looked on it from the time of Moses as condemned by the Fifth Commandment. And you're not executing a criminal as an individual. You're executing him as presenting a lethal, irreparable threat to the right of innocent life in society. And you can't do that by vigilante justice. Suppose the prisoner was in prison, in death row, and another inmate killed him. He can't claim that he's executing him, because he has no right to do that. It has to be lawfully designated officer of the state. And suppose the person was doing it for private revenge. Well, he'd be guilty of murder subjectively, because he's not killing the person as a threat to the right to innocent life enjoyed by all the citizens. It's just to satisfy his own desires. So for that reason, because there is some ambiguity in this, when Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a letter to the bishops of the United States during the election in the middle 2000s on the question of whether a Catholic could dissent from church teaching and go to communion, okay, he made a distinction. This is what he says: not all moral issues have the same moral weight as abortion and euthanasia. For example, if a Catholic were at odds with the Holy Father on the application of capital punishment or on a decision to wage war, he would not for that reason be considered unworthy to present himself for Holy Communion. While the church exhorts civil authorities to seek peace, not war, and to exercise discretion and mercy in imposing punishment on criminals, it may be permissible to take up arms to repel an aggressor or have recourse to the capital punishment. And you know, when the church says it's inadmissible to do capital punishment, this is the dignity of the person, the implication is, well, then killing in war must be too, or trying to save someone in the line of duty as a policeman. So therefore, the cardinal concludes, there may be a legitimate diversity of opinion, even among Catholics, about waging war and applying the death penalty, but not, however, with regard to abortion and euthanasia, because you're always dealing with an innocent person in abortion and euthanasia. Even if you're killing yourself, there's no right for you to die. In fact, you don't have to take all the, extraordinary means necessary to preserve your life. And if you're in the process of dying, you might, and you need more morphine or something, it may in fact hasten your death. But it's not a right to die, all right? And our society has tried to enshrine a right to die. I live in Oregon, where euthanasia is legal. Assisted suicide is legal. However, they just give you the means. You have to do it to yourself. But the way to approach this, if you don't want to be hooked up to a machine or something, I think I told you this last night, is not by a living will. The church does not like living wills. And the reason is because who makes the decision is more or less left open. And it could be the doctor or the hospital, which, as you know today, because they're all interested in money, well, we need the bed, so just get rid of this one so we can get someone else. Now, you have to make the decision, and if you're incapacitated, you have to designate someone in particular to make the decision for you who knows your mind on this subject and what you would want. So the church recommends a durable power of attorney. In fact, in my order, we all have to sign durable powers of attorney. Who we leave in charge? Well, I left the superior in charge, but I had a friend who died prematurely. But when he made his out, he says, oh, I'm not leaving the order in charge of this decision for me. They'll commit euthanasia on me. He says, I'm leaving my family in charge of this. I don't trust the superiors. But you have a right to pick the person and to open your mind to them whom you think would know best what your will would be if you were asked. So, obviously, abortion is forbidden by this commandment. Murder is forbidden by this commandment. Euthanasia is forbidden by this commandment. And you can go down the list as to things that might relate to that. Among them is suicide. And you might say, well, why are we discussing suicide today? How many young people commit suicide? I'm astonished. And how many teenagers kill themselves? The church has always condemned suicide. And even though we recognize there may be emotional reasons why a person does this that rob them of some responsibility, you're also robbing society of someone who might make an important contribution to it. Each one of us has a contribution to make to our society. So suicide is a mortal sin. Now, everybody that does it might not be guilty of it. Before we emphasize this so much by not allowing the person to be buried in consecrated ground. Now, as you know, we've changed that now because we accept the fact that there may be psychological reasons for this that aren't in the person's control. But still, suicide is an extremely important sin because you're killing yourself as an innocent person. So tomorrow night I'll finish this up, but then we have to do adultery, theft, and lying, which is all too prevalent in our society today. So thank you very much for coming. And I think we're going to give you a blessing.